I'm going to talk now to Barak Sina, who is a Senior Research Fellow from the Henry Jackson Society. Barak, good morning, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
If we were to send thousands of interceptor drones to the Gulf, how much of an escalation is that of Britain's role in this conflict?
It's not such an escalation. It's also important to know that these Octopus interceptor drones that we hope to send to the Middle East are already being used in Ukraine. But it's not just simply an issue of resources, it's an issue of political will. While America has urged the UK to send ships to the Straits of Hormuz in order to unblock it as part of this international effort, the government is only considering deploying a ship to the Gulf, and it's not made a final decision. And it's semi-political will, but it's also semi-lack of resources. And I do have to quote Admiral Lord West of Spithead, the former First Sea Lord, who said, the sad thing is the 4 ships that we used to have in Bahrain, not least to keep the Straits of Hormuz open. And what have we done? We withdrew them before this war began. We still don't have warships between Gibraltar and Singapore. That shows a lack of strategic understanding of maritime power. So the UK has, it seeks to send this Octopus interceptor drones, but it also has autonomous mine hunting systems in the region, and perhaps could send a nuclear attack submarine called the HMS Anson. It's left Australia, but it's unknown whether it is heading towards the Straits of Hormuz. But it's really essential to have this international flotilla, this international effort in order to force Iran to force open the Straits of Hormuz. And it's quite remarkable that after all these years of strategic planning of a scenario in which Iran does block the Straits of Hormuz, that the UK it doesn't have the assets to effectively complement the US's strategic efforts.
So you're pretty dismissive from what you're saying, Barak, about the interceptor drones. You just don't think that is much of a commitment by Britain. But
I mean, it's important, but to a degree.
Right.
So, for example, it can perhaps protect British special forces in Erbil in Iraq, who are vulnerable to this cheap, mass-produced Iranian unmanned aerial vehicles, because servicemen in Cyprus and their families are vulnerable to these attacks. However, it's not adequate. You know, you're talking about as well removing mines. You're talking about as well preventing small vessels, small Iranian vessels, from actually attempting to target international ships. So it isn't really adequate. And one of there's a couple of reasons for the inadequacy of Britain's capabilities. Britain's naval resources are so depleted that it just doesn't have minesweepers in Bahrain or even a frigate in the Mediterranean. And there's been decades of underinvestment. There's a shrinking fleet size. The last major warship in the region, the HMS Lancaster, it retired in 2025, and the HMS Middleton was withdrawn in March 2026. And finally, at a strategic level, the UK has prioritized European security over Middle East. Britain wants to have trade, it wants to protect shipping lanes, and yet it's not prioritized doing that. Its 2025 Strategic Defense Review prioritized security in Europe and the North Atlantic over the Middle East, diverting resources away from the Middle East, and it's left the UK unable to maintain a continuous, significant maritime presence in the Gulf.
And it is curious, Barak, the government says it is considering whether to dispatch a ship there. Well, we know how long it took to send the the one that's on its way. I mean, they only decided on the Tuesday after the war began that they would dispatch a ship, and it took over a week to send it off. What is the consideration that could be, which may prevent the Prime Minister and the Defence Secretary from sending a Royal Navy battleship to the region? What are they most concerned about? That it's struck, or that it will be seen by Iran as a major escalation and therefore make Britain more vulnerable perhaps to terror attacks, or perhaps the Cyprus Air Base could become an even bigger target?
Look, I think that escalation is inevitable. That's the current trajectory. Bear in mind what was the original rationale of the UK not to engage in Iran, and it claimed it was because it was to shore up, to uphold principles of international law. However, now that Iran is just striking, lashing out across the entire Gulf at Cyprus, the British government doesn't have that excuse anymore. It could easily engage. So the lack of political will is also reflective of the lack of capabilities. You know, there was a very important book that came out in the early 2000s called Paradise and Power by Robert Kagan, where he spoke about the fact that America was more militaristic because it had the capability to do so, and European states were more diplomatically orientated simply because they lacked the military capability. So their morals reflect their capacities. Britain at the moment now that has taken this line of appeasement, ineptitude, attempting to consider whether they will allocate any resources, it really is at a fundamental level reflecting the fact that Britain doesn't actually have the capabilities to be an effective strategic partner to America, and the US knows that. This spells the beginning of the end of that special relationship.
How very interesting. That's Barak Sina, who is a senior research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society, so suggesting even if the Prime Minister was inclined to disport America, we don't really have the military capability. Thanks so much for joining us. Now, there's